They say the most dangerous lies are the ones hiding in plain sight. I learned that when I picked up my wife's phone to check the weather and saw a notification that made my blood freeze. Marcus just sent your husband will never know. The screen went dark before I could read more, but those 7 words rewrote everything I thought I knew about my marriage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is David Chen, and I've spent the last 15 years building network infrastructure for mid-sized companies across Oregon. I troubleshoot systems that break when nobody's watching, trace problems through miles of cable, and find patterns where others see chaos. My wife Elena used to joke that I could debug a relationship the same way I debug a server crash. She stopped making that joke about 6 months ago. We live in a craftsman house in Portland's Hawthorne district, the kind with original hardwood floors that creak when you walk barefoot to the kitchen at dawn. I bought it 3 years after we married, back when Elena worked part-time at a bookstore and talked about writing novels on rainy afternoons. Those afternoons became client meetings when she landed a position at Morrison Associates, a marketing firm downtown that specializes in tech startups with more venture capital than common sense. Elena transformed overnight from someone who wore paint-stained sweaters to someone who owned 5 different blazers and knew which wine pairs with which networking event. I watched her confidence bloom like a time-lapse video, proud of how she commanded conference rooms and turned hesitant entrepreneurs into believers. Success looked stunning on her. I just didn't realize it came with a different zip code than our marriage. The notification happened on a Thursday morning while she showered before another early meeting. Her phone sat on the nightstand face up, the way people leave phones when they have nothing to hide. The weather app was my excuse. Portland rain demands preparation, and I had 3 site visits scheduled across the metro area. I touched the screen to wake it up just as the banner slid down from the top. Marcus just sent your husband will never know. The preview cut off there, but the timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. the night before. While I was asleep 6 feet away, someone named Marcus was sending my wife messages designed to be secrets. The shower kept running. Steam drifted under the bathroom door. I set the phone down exactly where I found it and walked to the kitchen with hands that felt borrowed from someone else's body. Coffee becomes ritual when your routine breaks. I measured grounds, added water, listened to the machine wake up and begin its work. Normal sounds in a house that suddenly felt like it belonged to strangers. Elena emerged 20 minutes later in a charcoal dress I'd never seen, hair still damp, moving with the efficient grace of someone who had scheduled intimacy into next quarter's projections. She kissed my cheek and grabbed her phone in the same motion, muscle memory perfected through months of practice I'd never noticed until now. The screen came alive in her hand. I watched her thumb move to messages, paused, then swiped the notification away like crumbs from a counter. She looked up and smiled, the same smile that used to mean Saturday mornings in bed and takeout containers on the coffee table. Running late, she said, already reaching for her bag. Client presentation at 9. Don't wait up tonight if the drinks run long. The phrase hung in the air like incense after church, familiar and somehow sanctified by repetition. How many times had I heard some version of those words? How many times had I nodded and returned to my laptop while she disappeared into evenings I never questioned? I told her good luck with the presentation. I meant it the same way I'd meant it every other time. The front door closed with its usual complaint about humidity and settling foundations. Her car started in the driveway. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her back out, turn left toward the bridge, and vanish into morning traffic that would carry her to places I was apparently not invited to imagine. Network problems follow patterns. A router fails, traffic reroutes, performance degrades gradually until someone notices the lag and calls for help. The failure usually started weeks earlier with dropped packets too small to trigger alerts. By the time symptoms appear, the damage has already spread through the system like a slow infection. I spent that morning running cable through the ceiling of a dental office, threading Ethernet through spaces designed for pipes and air wes, taxing air, ducts. Physical work helps when your mind won't stop looping the same 7 words. Your husband will never know. The phrase had weight, implication, the kind of certainty that comes from experience rather than wishful thinking. Marcus wasn't making a promise. He was stating a fact based on evidence I didn't want to acknowledge. My marriage had a security breach, and I'd been too busy maintaining other people's networks to notice the intrusion in my own system. The dental office job finished early. I drove home through neighborhoods where people hung Halloween decorations and argued about leaf collection schedules, ordinary concerns that felt like broadcasts from a planet I used to live on. Our house sat quiet in the afternoon light, windows reflecting sky and telephone poles like a postcard of domestic stability. Elena's laptop lived on the kitchen counter, closed but not sleeping. She worked from home Tuesdays and Fridays, video calls that required good lighting and backgrounds free of clutter. I'd upgraded our internet twice to support her streaming needs, installed mesh networking that eliminated dead zones because partnership means solving problems together. The laptop knew her passwords, auto-saved credentials, cached sessions, the digital equivalent of leaving doors unlocked in a neighborhood where trust used to be the only security you needed. I stared at the silver case and felt gravity pull in two directions. Opening it would violate the kind of trust that holds marriages together. Not opening it meant living with questions that would eat through my sleep like acid. I made tea instead. Earl Grey, the way Elena taught me, 2 minutes exactly, no sugar. Routine as meditation, buying time while my conscience and curiosity wrestled for control. Steam rose from the cup like incense, and I thought about the difference between privacy and secrecy. Privacy protects personal space. Secrecy protects personal choices. Elena had always been private about work details, client confidentiality, the professional boundaries that kept her credible in rooms full of people who measured success in quarterly reports. But secrecy felt different. Secrecy required active maintenance, careful choreography, the kind of energy that leaves fingerprints if you know where to look. The laptop opened without resistance. Elena's desktop appeared, organized folders labeled by client names and project phases, the visual equivalent of a mind that sorted chaos into manageable lists.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Her browser was still logged into email, social media, the productivity apps that turned human ambition into actionable metrics. I scrolled through recent browsing history like an archaeologist examining layers of sediment. Marketing blogs, competitor analysis, restaurant reviews, the normal detritus of professional life mixed with personal maintenance. Then, buried between a LinkedIn article and a hotel booking site, I found something that didn't fit the pattern. A search query from 3 days ago, how to delete message history on iPhone, followed by another, can deleted text be recovered by spouse, and finally Portland hotels downtown privacy policies. Each search was a breadcrumb leading toward a conclusion I didn't want to reach. Elena wasn't just receiving secret messages, she was researching how to keep them secret, studying the technology of deception with the same methodical approach she brought to client campaigns. The tea had gone cold in my hand. I sat at our kitchen table, surrounded by the artifacts of shared domesticity, reading evidence that my wife was building parallel systems I wasn't supposed to access. The afternoon light shifted through windows we'd chosen together, illuminating a life that felt increasingly like a set constructed for an audience of one. Elena's phone records lived in our shared account, protected by a login I'd set up years ago when we combined our cellular plans to save money. $28 monthly, the accountant's approach to romance that seemed practical at the time. Now it felt like the key to a room I'd never intended to build. The records went back 6 months in detail, every call and text itemized with military precision. Elena averaged 40 to 50 texts per day, most clustered during business hours, conversations with clients and colleagues whose names I recognized from dinner table stories about deadline stress and budget negotiations. But threaded through the professional communications was another pattern, messages exchanged with a number I didn't recognize. The frequency had increased over the past 8 weeks, from 2 or 3 texts weekly to daily exchanges that often extended past midnight. On days when Elena came home late citing client dinners, the messages spiked. Last Tuesday, while she attended what she called a strategy session with the Morrison partners, the unknown number had sent 14 texts between 7 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. The record showed she'd responded to each one, sometimes within seconds, the rapid-fire rhythm of conversations that couldn't wait for more convenient timing. I cross-referenced the mystery number with Elena's contacts, business cards scattered in kitchen drawers, names mentioned in passing during the small talk that used to bind our evenings together. Marcus Walsh, Senior Creative Director at Pinnacle Digital, a competing firm that had poached 3 Morrison accounts in the past year. Elena had mentioned Marcus exactly twice in my hearing, once to complain about his aggressive tactics during a pitch meeting, once to grudgingly admit he'd won a client she'd been courting for months. Both times she'd spoken his name with the kind of professional irritation reserved for worthy opponents. Apparently, irritation had evolved into something requiring privacy settings and browser history deletion. I spent that evening assembling a timeline, cross-referencing Elena's stated schedule with her actual digital footprint. Network security had taught me to follow data trails rather than assumptions. Logs don't lie. They can be incomplete, misleading, or corrupted. but they don't choose sides or protect feelings. The picture emerging from Elena's phone records looked like a relationship developing in parallel to our marriage, hidden in the gaps between official explanations. Late-night client meetings that generated no billable hours. Business dinners at restaurants with no corporate accounts. Strategy sessions that happened at hotels rather than conference rooms. 3 weeks ago, on a night Elena said she was visiting her sister in Salem, her phone had pinged cell towers exclusively in downtown Portland, moving between locations that traced a route from Pinnacle Digital's office to the Marriott downtown, then to a wine bar that stayed open until 2 a.m. Her sister lived 45 minutes south on I-5. Elena's phone had never left the city center. I felt like a systems administrator discovering unauthorized access to secure servers, following intrusion logs that led deeper into compromised infrastructure. Every search revealed additional vulnerabilities I'd never thought to monitor. Trust, it turned out, was a single point of failure that brought down the entire network when it finally broke. The front door opened at 9:47 p.m., which matched Elena's typical Thursday schedule when client drinks ran predictably long. She entered with practice quiet, shoes left by the door, keys deposited in the bowl we'd bought at a craft fair during the first year of our marriage, when such purchases felt like investments in permanent joy. I was reading on the couch, the same spot where she'd find me most evenings, surrounded by technical manuals and industry publications that kept my skills current in a field that evolved faster than human adaptation. She kissed the top of my head and mentioned something about a successful presentation and drinks that led to a potential contract extension. Her phone buzzed during the recap. She glanced at the screen, smiled slightly, then placed it face down on the coffee table between us. The gesture felt rehearsed, casual in the way that comes from repetition rather than instinct. She asked about my day. I told her about the dental office cabling project, the satisfaction of solving routing problems through methodical troubleshooting. We talked for 20 minutes about Halloween plans, weekend schedules, the ordinary logistics of shared domesticity. Elena laughed at appropriate moments, maintained eye contact, displayed all the conversational behaviors that signaled attention and engagement. But her phone buzzed 3 more times during our discussion, and each buzz created a tiny flinch, a micro-expression that suggested divided attention despite the performance of presence. She excused herself for a shower around 10:30, taking the phone with her into the bathroom. The sound of running water covered whatever conversation she needed to have in private. I sat on the couch and listened to the house settle around me, wooden beams contracting as temperatures dropped, the structural sounds of a home that no longer felt like shelter. Elena emerged from the bathroom 40 minutes later, which was roughly twice her normal shower duration. She claimed the hot water felt good after a long day, that the steam helped her decompress from client stress. She kissed me good night and mentioned an early morning meeting that would require another dawn departure. I waited until her breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep, then relocated to the guest room with a pillow and the excuse of insomnia caused by project deadlines. The lie came easily, which surprised me. Deception, apparently, was contagious once it entered a household's ecosystem. Sleep arrived in fragments, interrupted by the awareness that the person next to me was becoming a stranger whose movements and motivations I could no longer predict. I'd built our home network to be redundant and secure, but I'd never considered that the biggest threat might come from an authorized user who'd simply changed their access priorities. Friday morning brought rain and a text message that Elena read while I scrambled eggs for breakfast. She announced a weekend business trip to Seattle, a client emergency that required immediate attention and would probably extend through Sunday. The explanation included specific details about flight times and hotel accommodations, the kind of comprehensive coverage that suggested preparation rather than spontaneous crisis management. I offered to drive her to the airport. She declined, citing early departure times and long-term parking arrangements already made. She'd learned to anticipate my helpfulness and prepare defenses against it, which felt like a skill she shouldn't have needed to develop. Elena left at 7:30 a.m. with a rolling suitcase and the efficiency of someone who packed for trips with practice frequency. She kissed me goodbye and promised to call when she landed, standard operating procedure for business travel that had become more frequent over the past several months. I waited 30 minutes, then accessed our shared credit card account to confirm her travel arrangements. The charges told a different story than her explanation. No airline ticket, No Seattle hotel reservation. Instead, I found a restaurant charge from Thursday night at a place called Canard, a high-end establishment in Portland's Pearl District known for its wine selection and intimate atmosphere. The charge was split between two cards, suggesting Elena had paid for drinks while someone else covered dinner. The timing aligned perfectly with her client meeting that had run long and required celebratory drinks afterward. Except the client, according to her phone records, had been Marcus Walsh, whose office was 6 blocks from Canard and whose late-night text messages were becoming a daily occurrence. Elena wasn't in Seattle. She was somewhere in Portland maintaining an elaborate fiction that required constant coordination and energy management. The weekend trip was cover for activities that needed uninterrupted time and privacy from domestic oversight. I spent Friday afternoon installing security cameras around the house, small devices disguised as everyday objects that would monitor entry and exit patterns. Network security extended to physical premises, and I wanted to document whether Elena's stated schedule matched her actual movements. The cameras were legal, installed on property I co-owned and in common areas where privacy expectations were limited. They would provide timestamps and visual confirmation of Elena's presence or absence, data points that could corroborate or contradict her verbal reports about her whereabouts. That evening, alone in a house that felt like a stage set waiting for actors to return, I called Elena's hotel in Seattle. The reservations desk confirmed they had no guest registered under her name for the weekend. When I asked about corporate bookings under Morrison Associates, they found no recent activity for that company either. Elena called at 9 p.m. from her hotel room, which sounded remarkably similar to our bedroom with its familiar acoustics and ambient noise. She described a successful client meeting and mentioned plans for dinner with the prospect's marketing team, details that established her location and activities with unnecessary precision. Background sounds during our conversation included traffic patterns consistent with downtown Portland rather than Seattle, and what sounded like the ice machine from the hotel 3 blocks from Pinnacle Digital's office. A location I'd researched earlier as part of my growing intelligence file on Marcus Walsh's professional and personal infrastructure. We talked for 15 minutes about work stress, weekend plans that would now be postponed, and the possibility that her client meeting might extend into early next week. Elena's voice carried the casual confidence of someone who'd told the same story multiple times and refined it through repetition. After hanging up, I sat in our kitchen and realized I was living with a person who had constructed an alternate reality that required constant maintenance and performance. The Elena who kissed me goodbye that morning was playing a role that had become more demanding than our actual relationship. The cameras would tell me where she was. Her phone records would tell me who she was with. But I was beginning to understand that the most important questions couldn't be answered through surveillance and data analysis. I could prove Elena was lying, but I couldn't fix whatever had motivated her to start lying in the first place. Network intrusions happen gradually, then suddenly. Small vulnerabilities accumulate until the entire system becomes compromised. Recovery requires understanding how the breach occurred and what the intruder gained access to before implementing new security measures. My marriage had been compromised through social engineering rather than technical failure. Elena had used her authorized access to gradually expand her privileges until she could operate with minimal oversight. The question now was whether the relationship could be patched and secured, or whether it needed to be rebuilt from scratch with better authentication protocols. I spent Saturday morning researching Marcus Walsh through professional networks and social media profiles. 43 years old, divorced 2 years ago, senior creative director with a reputation for innovative campaigns and client retention. His LinkedIn profile emphasized collaboration and strategic thinking, personal values that had apparently extended to collaborative relationships with married competitors. His Instagram account, which Elena followed under her business profile, showed a lifestyle of restaurant openings, art gallery events, and weekend trips to wine country. Recent posts included locations I recognized from Elena's unexplained absences over the past 2 months. A hiking trail where she'd supposedly met a college friend. A brewery where she'd claimed to attend a networking event. A jazz club that had hosted her book club's monthly gathering. The digital evidence was building a case that required no legal precedent. Elena and Marcus had been constructing a shared social calendar that existed in parallel to her marriage, using business networking as camouflage for personal relationship development. Saturday evening brought a text from Elena describing a successful client dinner and early bedtime required by Sunday morning meetings. The message arrived with a Seattle timestamp but routing data that indicated Portland cellular towers. Technology had made deception more sophisticated but also more traceable for anyone with the skills to follow data packets to their actual source. I spent the night reading about infidelity recovery, relationship counseling, and divorce proceedings, researching options for problems I'd never expected to need solutions for. The literature emphasized communication, honesty, and mutual commitment to rebuilding trust that had been compromised through secrecy and deception. But communication required participants willing to acknowledge reality rather than maintaining fictional narratives. Divorce to Mesabint. Naj persulbat najbos pri and tester naz. What the pre? Elena had invested too much energy in her alternate story to abandon it without significant motivation. I needed leverage that would make honesty more attractive than continued deception. Sunday morning arrived with rain and a phone call from Elena's mother, who asked to speak with her daughter about Thanksgiving dinner plans. I explained that Elena was in Seattle on business and would return that evening. Her mother paused, then mentioned that Elena had called her Friday night from what sounded like a local restaurant, wondering why she would drive to Seattle after dinner in Portland. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, long enough for me to realize that Elena's deception extended beyond our marriage into relationships with family members who cared about her safety and whereabouts. Her mother expressed concern about Elena's work schedule and stress levels, observations that suggested the lies had become noticeable to people who knew her well. Elena returned home Sunday evening with stories about productive meetings and potential contract expansions, details that demonstrated her growing skill at constructing believable narratives under pressure. She unpacked efficiently and asked about my weekend with the casual interest of someone checking boxes on a domestic maintenance list. I told her about household projects and errands, normal weekend activities that felt increasingly surreal in the context of our evolving relationship dynamics. We discussed dinner plans, television shows, and the weather forecast with the conversational patterns of married couples who still shared physical space but had diverged into separate emotional territories. Her phone buzzed during dinner. Elena read the message and smiled, the kind of expression that suggested private jokes and shared understanding with someone who wasn't sitting at our table. When I asked about the message, she mentioned a work colleague confirming Monday meeting details, an explanation that had become her default response to any questions about unexpected communications. That night I moved permanently to the guest room with the explanation that my snoring had been keeping Elena awake during stressful work periods. She accepted the arrangement without resistance, which suggested that my physical presence had become more obligation than comfort. I lay in the narrow bed surrounded by boxes of Christmas decorations and old electronics, listening to Elena move through our evening routine in the master bedroom. Her phone conversation that night lasted 90 minutes, conducted in whispers that carried through walls not designed to contain secrets. The voice belonged to someone who laughed easily and spoke with intimacy that suggested familiarity beyond professional collaboration. Elena's responses included phrases like "I know" and "me too" and "tomorrow can't come soon enough," conversational fragments that painted a picture of emotional connection I hadn't experienced with her in months. When the call ended around midnight, I heard Elena typing on her laptop, the rapid clicking of someone composing messages that required immediate attention. Light from her screen created shadows under the bedroom door until nearly 2 a.m., evidence of digital activities that consumed more of her attention than our marriage had received in recent memory. Monday morning brought the realization that I was living with someone who had emotionally relocated to a different relationship while maintaining the physical appearance of our domestic partnership. Elena had become a tenant in the life we'd built together, paying minimal rent through surface-level interaction while investing her real energy elsewhere. The question now wasn't whether Elena was having an affair. The evidence had answered that question through multiple sources and methods. The question was whether confronting her with proof would lead to honest conversation about relationship repair, or whether it would simply force her to develop more sophisticated deception techniques. I spent Monday morning drafting an email that I would never send, organizing my thoughts and evidence into a coherent presentation that outlined the facts without accusations or ultimatums. The process helped clarify what I actually wanted from a confrontation versus what my injured pride demanded as compensation for the lies and betrayal. What I wanted was simple acknowledgement of reality and discussion of options that might preserve our relationship if Elena was willing to end her involvement with Marcus and commit to rebuilding trust through transparency and consistent honesty. What my pride wanted was public humiliation for both Elena and Marcus, consequences that would match the emotional damage their deception had caused, and validation that their behavior was wrong by social and moral standards I still believed in despite evidence that those standards weren't universally shared. The difference between wanting and needing would determine whether I approached the situation as someone seeking relationship repair or someone seeking relationship destruction. Both options were available, only one offered the possibility of a future that included Elena. I deleted the email and decided to give her one final opportunity to choose honesty without coercion or confrontation that might trigger defensive responses and deeper deception. Sometimes the most effective security measure is simply asking direct questions and creating space for truthful answers. Tuesday evening I asked Elena to sit with me in the living room for a conversation about our relationship and future plans. She agreed with the wariness of someone who sensed that casual discussion had been replaced by formal agenda items requiring her full attention. I told her I'd been feeling disconnected from her recently and wanted to understand whether work stress was temporary or whether our relationship dynamics needed adjustment to accommodate her changing priorities and career demands. The question was designed to offer her an opening for honest discussion without forcing her into defensive positions. Elena responded with generalities about work pressure and industry competition, explanations that acknowledged stress without addressing relationship impact. When I asked specifically about her happiness and satisfaction with our marriage, she said she was content but tired, grateful for my support but overwhelmed by professional obligations that required more time and energy than she'd anticipated. I asked whether she felt we were growing apart or simply going through a difficult period that would resolve itself once her current projects concluded. She said she wasn't sure, that she hadn't had time to think about relationship issues because work had consumed all her mental bandwidth for months. The conversation continued for an hour, long enough for me to realize that Elena was either genuinely unaware of how dramatically her behavior had changed, or she was committed to maintaining her fictional narrative even during direct discussions about relationship problems. When I asked whether there was anything she needed to tell me about changes in her life or priorities, she shook her head and said she was handling everything as well as possible under current circumstances. The response felt like a final answer to questions I wouldn't ask again. That night, Elena fell asleep quickly while I stared at the ceiling and accepted that our marriage had ended without official declaration or mutual acknowledgement. Elena had already moved on emotionally and practically. I was simply the last person to receive notification of the change. Wednesday morning I began making plans for life after Elena that didn't depend on her participation or approval. The network security approach to relationship recovery had taught me that some intrusions couldn't be repaired through patches and updates. Sometimes the entire system needed to be rebuilt with different architecture and stronger authentication requirements. I would give Elena one final opportunity to choose honesty and relationship repair. If she declined, I would proceed with documentation and evidence gathering that would protect my interests during whatever legal proceedings might follow. Network security principles applied to marriage dissolution as much as they applied to data protection. Trust, once compromised, required extraordinary measures to restore. Elena would need to demonstrate commitment to transparency and accountability that went far beyond verbal promises and good intentions. Without that demonstration, our relationship would remain permanently vulnerable to future intrusions that could destroy whatever remained of our shared infrastructure. Thursday morning arrived with news that would either save our marriage or provide the final evidence needed to end it definitively. Elena announced another weekend business trip, this time to San Francisco, urgent client meetings that couldn't be postponed or conducted remotely. The explanation included specific details about flight times, hotel accommodations, and meeting schedules that could be verified through multiple sources. If Elena was telling the truth, I would apologize for my suspicions and commit to rebuilding trust damaged by my own insecurity and paranoia. If she was lying, I would have documentation of deception that could no longer be explained through work stress or miscommunication. The weekend would provide final confirmation of Elena's priorities and commitment to our marriage versus her commitment to whatever relationship she'd been developing with Marcus Walsh. I told Elena I hoped her meetings went well and asked her to call when she arrived safely. She promised to stay in touch and mentioned looking forward to relaxing together when she returned Sunday evening. The interaction felt like a final test that would determine whether our relationship could survive the truth or whether it had already been destroyed by the absence of truth. Friday afternoon, after Elena departed for the airport with her rolling suitcase and carefully constructed travel story, I called the San Francisco hotel where she claimed to be staying. The reservations desk confirmed they had no guest registered under Elena's name for the weekend. When I asked about corporate bookings under Morrison Associates, they found no recent reservations for that company either. Elena's fictional business trip was as elaborate and unverifiable as her previous weekend in Seattle that had never left Portland. The final evidence was collected, the intrusion was documented, the unauthorized access had been traced to its source and confirmed through multiple verification methods. Elena had compromised our marriage's security through systematic deception that could no longer be explained as temporary work stress or miscommunication. Saturday morning I began preparing for conversations that would either repair our relationship through complete honesty and transparency, or end it through formal dissolution that protected both parties' interests and dignity. Network security had taught me that recovery plans needed to account for both best-case and worst-case scenarios. Elena's choice would determine which scenario became our reality, but the choice was no longer mine to make. I had gathered the evidence, asked the questions and provided opportunities for honest communication. The next move belonged to Elena and whatever relationship she ultimately decided to prioritize. The weekend stretched ahead like a final diagnostic test that would determine whether our marriage's infrastructure could handle the load of truth, or whether it would crash under the weight of revelations that had been building pressure for months. Either way, the uncertainty would finally end. Network problems couldn't be fixed until they were accurately diagnosed. Elena and I were about to discover what our relationship actually was versus what we'd been pretending it could remain despite evidence that suggested otherwise. The truth would either set us free to rebuild something stronger or free us to build something new with different people who shared our values about honesty, commitment, and the basic requirements for maintaining trust in relationships that claimed to be permanent. Saturday morning broke gray and quiet, the kind of Portland weather that makes indoor planning feel virtuous rather than antisocial. I sat at the kitchen table with coffee that had gone lukewarm and a legal pad covered in network diagrams that mapped relationships instead of servers. The evidence was comprehensive but circumstantial. Elena was lying about her whereabouts and maintaining an emotional connection with Marcus that violated every boundary of our marriage, but knowing something and proving it to the satisfaction of legal proceedings were different skill sets entirely. Network forensics had taught me that documentation beats intuition every time. Hunches couldn't survive cross-examination. Timestamps could. I needed irrefutable proof that would force honest conversation or provide protection during whatever came next. Elena had chosen deception over disclosure repeatedly. My response needed to be methodical enough to withstand scrutiny from divorce attorneys who specialized in attacking the credibility of evidence gathered by suspicious spouses. The first step was establishing Elena's actual location during her fictional San Francisco trip. GPS data from her phone would provide definitive coordinates, but accessing that information required either her consent or legal authority I didn't possess. However, our shared credit card account would show transaction locations in real time, creating a financial trail that couldn't be falsified or explained away through creative storytelling. I logged into our banking portal and set up automatic alerts for any card activity. Elena typically used credit for everything except small cash purchases, a habit that would generate an electronic breadcrumb trail throughout her weekend. If she was actually in San Francisco, the charges would cluster around the airport, her claimed hotel and restaurants near her supposed meeting locations. If she was in Portland with Marcus, the pattern would tell a different story entirely. The first charge appeared at 11:47 a.m. $43 at Screen Door, a popular brunch restaurant in Portland's Burnside district known for weekend waits and Instagram-worthy plates. The transaction timestamp showed Elena was eating fried chicken and biscuits 6 blocks from Marcus's apartment while supposedly attending urgent client meetings 400 miles south. 20 minutes later, another charge, $18 at Powell's Books downtown, the kind of spontaneous purchase that suggested leisure rather than business crisis.
Elena had bought something while browsing literary fiction, an activity that required relaxed schedule and personal interest rather than corporate emergency management. By mid-afternoon, the charges painted a picture of tourism in her own city. A coffee shop in the Pearl District, a wine tasting in the Alberta Arts District, dinner at Le Pigeon, one of Portland's most romantic restaurants, and definitely not a place where crisis management meetings occurred. Each transaction was time-stamped and geolocated with precision that eliminated any possibility of mistaken identity or fraudulent use. Elena was conducting a local vacation while maintaining the fiction of business travel. The elaborate deception required constant vigilance and energy management that seemed exhausting rather than sustainable. I found myself almost impressed by the logistics involved in coordinating schedules, maintaining alibis, and remembering which version of events she'd told to which audience. Sunday brought a charge at the Heathman Hotel's restaurant, a location I recognized from Marcus's Instagram posts as his preferred venue for client entertainment.
The timing aligned with Elena's supposed checkout from her San Francisco hotel and preparation for her flight home. Except she was apparently enjoying Eggs Benedict in downtown Portland while texting me updates about airport delays and turbulence. The financial evidence was conclusive but insufficient for the conversation Elena and I needed to have. Credit card records proved she was lying about her location, but they didn't document the emotional betrayal that had dissolved our marriage incrementally over months of careful deception. I needed evidence that would force acknowledgement of the affair itself, not just the lies that concealed it. That afternoon I drove to the Heathman Hotel and confirmed Elena's car in the parking structure, license plate visible and recognizable despite her claims to be at PDX awaiting delayed flights. I photographed the vehicle, the timestamp, the location markers that would establish her presence beyond reasonable doubt. Then I waited in my own car with coffee and the patience that comes from understanding that truth reveals itself to observers who can resist the urge to accelerate natural processes. Elena emerged from the hotel at 4:23 p.m. accompanied by Marcus Walsh, whose appearance matched his LinkedIn profile and social media presence exactly. They walked together with the casual intimacy of people comfortable in each other's physical space, hands occasionally touching, conversation animated and private. They looked like a couple who had spent the weekend discovering shared interests and planning future adventures. I photographed their interaction from across the street, using a telephoto lens that provided clear documentation without requiring proximity that might compromise the surveillance. The images showed Elena in a sundress I'd never seen, laughing at something Marcus had said, her body language displaying affection and attention she hadn't directed toward me in months. They separated at Elena's car with a kiss that lasted longer than professional courtesy but shorter than passionate romance. The kiss of people who were developing emotional intimacy but maintaining some boundaries around public displays of affection. Marcus waited until Elena's car left the parking structure before walking to his own vehicle, a behavior pattern that suggested coordination designed to prevent witnesses from connecting them as a couple. Elena called 20 minutes later from PDX to report that her delayed flight had finally boarded and she would be home by 8 p.m. as originally scheduled. Her voice carried the breathless excitement of someone rushing through an airport, complete with background noise that could have been gate announcements or traffic on I-84. The performance was sophisticated enough to fool someone who wasn't actively monitoring her actual location through multiple sources. I told her I was looking forward to her return and asked how her meetings had concluded. She described successful negotiations and potential contract extensions, details that demonstrated her ability to construct believable narratives under pressure while simultaneously managing the logistics of maintaining her fictional San Francisco timeline. The call ended with mutual expressions of affection that felt like reading scripts written for characters we'd both outgrown. Elena promised to share details about her successful trip when she arrived home. I promised to have dinner waiting and the house comfortable for her return from business travel that had never occurred. Elena arrived home at 8:17 p.m. with her rolling suitcase and stories about productive client meetings that had exceeded expectations. She unpacked efficiently while describing restaurant recommendations from colleagues and tourist attractions she'd observed during brief breaks between negotiations. The fictional narrative was detailed enough to survive casual questioning but would collapse under sustained scrutiny from anyone with access to contradictory evidence. I listened to her San Francisco stories while preparing the promised dinner, letting her elaborate on details that demonstrated significant preparation and creativity. Elena had researched the city enough to include specific landmarks, restaurant names, and weather conditions that added authenticity to her fabricated experience. The deception represented substantial mental labor invested in maintaining a lie that served no purpose except concealing her actual activities. We ate dinner while Elena continued her travelogue, describing client personalities and meeting dynamics with the confidence of someone who had actually experienced the events she was narrating. Her performance was flawless until her phone buzzed with a text message that caused a micro-expression of pleasure before she could suppress it into neutral professionalism. When I asked about the message, Elena said a colleague was confirming Monday meeting details, the standard explanation she deployed for any unexpected communication that required immediate attention. But her response delay and facial expression suggested the text had generated personal rather than professional satisfaction, the kind of smile reserved for private jokes and intimate communication. That night, Elena unpacked her suitcase in our bedroom while I loaded the dishwasher and processed the weekend's revelations. Her clothes showed no evidence of airplane travel, hotel laundry, or the kind of wrinkles that accumulate during cross-country business trips. Everything looked freshly worn and carefully maintained, consistent with local activities rather than extended travel and intensive meeting schedules. I moved to the guest room again with the explanation that jet lag might make Elena restless and I had early morning appointments that required uninterrupted sleep. She accepted the arrangement without resistance, which confirmed that my physical presence had become more interruption than comfort in her daily routine. Through the walls I heard Elena's phone conversation that night, the whispered tones of someone sharing private experiences with a person who had participated in those experiences rather than someone receiving second-hand reports about business meetings. The call lasted over an hour, punctuated by laughter and responses that suggested intimate conversation rather than professional debriefing. When the call ended around midnight, Elena spent another 30 minutes typing on her laptop, the rapid keystrokes of someone composing messages that required immediate transmission despite the late hour. Light from her screen continued until nearly 2 a.m., evidence of digital communication that consumed more of her attention than our marriage had received in months. Monday morning brought the realization that confronting Elena with evidence would require strategic planning rather than emotional reaction. She had invested too much energy in maintaining her fictional narratives to abandon them without significant motivation. Simply presenting proof of her lies would likely trigger defensive responses and more sophisticated deception rather than honest acknowledgement and discussion of relationship repair. I needed leverage that would make honesty more attractive than continued deception. Network security principles suggested that the most effective approach was controlling access to resources the intruder valued more than the unauthorized access they'd obtained. Elena valued her professional reputation, her relationship with Marcus, and her ability to manage multiple narratives without external interference. Threatening any of those priorities directly would trigger defensive measures that could escalate into legal warfare. But creating circumstances where maintaining deception became more costly than choosing honesty might motivate voluntary disclosure and discussion of options for moving forward. That morning I scheduled a meeting with Elena for Thursday evening, sending a calendar invitation through our shared Google account with the subject line "Relationship Discussion Important." The formal approach would signal serious intent while providing time for Elena to prepare whatever response she thought the situation required. I also researched private investigators who specialized in marital disputes, not because I needed additional evidence but because professional documentation might be required for legal proceedings if Elena chose continued deception over honest conversation. The investigators I contacted emphasized discretion, legal compliance, and court-admissible evidence gathering that could survive cross-examination by hostile attorneys. Tuesday morning brought an unexpected development that changed the timeline of my planned confrontation. Elena announced that Marcus Walsh had been promoted to Regional Creative Director and would be relocating to Pinnacle Digital's Seattle office within the next month. The promotion was apparently sudden, based on client feedback and performance metrics that had impressed senior management. Elena delivered this information with careful neutrality, describing Marcus as a talented professional whose departure would create competitive advantages for Morrison Associates while acknowledging his skill and industry reputation. Her tone suggested professional respect rather than personal investment, but her body language indicated emotional impact she was working to conceal. I asked follow-up questions about how Marcus's departure might affect industry dynamics and client relationships. Elena responded with detailed analysis that demonstrated extensive knowledge of his professional capabilities and strategic importance, information that exceeded what she should have known about a competitor unless they'd had substantial personal discussions about career planning and industry trends. That evening, Elena received a phone call that required private conversation in our backyard, the kind of discussion that couldn't risk being overheard through interior walls. I watched her pace among the raised garden beds we'd built together during the second year of our marriage, her gestures animated and emotional despite the distance that prevented me from hearing specific words. The call lasted 45 minutes, long enough for Elena to cycle through multiple emotional states visible in her posture and movement patterns. When she returned inside, her eyes showed evidence of tears and her demeanor suggested significant stress rather than routine business conversation. I asked if everything was all right. Elena said work pressures were intensifying and industry changes were creating uncertainty about future opportunities.
When I offered to listen if she needed to discuss professional concerns, she said she was handling everything as well as possible under current circumstances and didn't want to burden me with problems I couldn't help solve. The response felt like final confirmation that Elena had emotionally relocated our marriage from primary relationship to secondary support system.
She was processing major life changes with Marcus rather than me, seeking comfort and advice from someone who apparently understood her professional world better than the person she'd promised to share life decisions with, for better or worse. Wednesday brought news that accelerated the timeline for confrontation beyond the Thursday meeting I'd scheduled. Elena announced that she would need to travel to Seattle the following week for transition meetings related to Marcus's promotion and the client relationships that would be affected by his departure. The trip would last through the weekend and might extend into the following week depending on how complex the transition process became. The explanation included specific details about meetings with Pinnacle Digital's senior management, strategy sessions with affected clients, and collaborative sessions designed to ensure smooth handoffs that protected both companies' interests. Elena described the trip as professionally necessary despite the personal inconvenience of extended travel during an already stressful period. I listened to her explanation while recognizing it as preparation for an extended period with Marcus before his relocation eliminated their opportunity for regular contact. The business justification was plausible enough to survive casual questioning, but the emotional undertone suggested personal rather than professional motivation for the intensive collaboration Elena was describing. That evening I called Elena's supervisor at Morrison Associates and inquired about the Seattle trip, describing myself as her husband who needed to understand the travel schedule for personal planning purposes. Elena's supervisor sounded confused when I mentioned transition meetings with Pinnacle Digital, stating that no formal collaboration had been authorized and Elena hadn't requested approval for business travel to Seattle. When I asked whether Elena was involved in any projects that required coordination with competitors, her supervisor said Morrison Associates maintained strict policies about competitor interaction and any such activities would require senior management approval that hadn't been requested or granted. Elena was apparently planning a Seattle trip that her employer knew nothing about and wouldn't authorize if asked. The discovery meant Elena was using vacation time or unpaid leave to travel to Seattle with Marcus, a personal decision disguised as business necessity to maintain her pattern of plausible professional explanations for private activities. She was investing her own resources and risking her professional standing to spend extended time with Marcus before his relocation made regular contact impossible. Thursday morning brought the scheduled relationship discussion that would either repair our marriage through honest acknowledgement of problems and commitment to solutions, or end it through Elena's continued commitment to deception and divided loyalties. I prepared for both scenarios with documentation that would protect my interests while leaving space for genuine reconciliation if Elena chose transparency over continued fiction. I arrived home that evening to find Elena dressed carefully and dinner prepared, the kind of attention to setting that suggested she understood the conversation would be significant and potentially decisive for our future. We ate with polite conversation about work and weekend plans, surface-level interaction that felt like preparation for more substantial discussion rather than avoidance of difficult topics. After dinner I asked Elena to sit with me in the living room and put away any devices that might interrupt our conversation. She complied with the wariness of someone who sensed that casual discussion had been replaced by formal agenda items requiring her full attention and careful responses. I began by expressing appreciation for our marriage and the life we built together, acknowledgement of positive elements that had genuine value regardless of current problems. Then I explained that I'd been feeling disconnected from Elena recently and wanted to understand whether external pressures were creating temporary difficulties or whether fundamental changes in our relationship required honest discussion and mutual adaptation. Elena responded with general statements about work stress and industry competition, explanations that acknowledged pressure without addressing relationship impact or personal choices that might be contributing to the distance between us. When I asked specifically about her happiness with our marriage and whether she felt satisfied with our emotional and physical connection, she said she was grateful for my support but overwhelmed by professional obligations that consumed most of her mental and emotional energy. I asked whether she felt we were growing apart temporarily due to career demands or whether deeper issues needed attention before they became permanent obstacles to intimacy and partnership. Elena said she hadn't had time to analyze relationship dynamics because work had required all her focus for months, but she believed we could address any problems once her current projects stabilized. The conversation continued for 30 minutes without Elena volunteering information about Marcus, her fictional travel stories, or the emotional investment she'd been making in a relationship that excluded me from participation or even acknowledgement. When I asked directly whether there was anything she needed to tell me about changes in her priorities or commitments, she said she was handling all her responsibilities as well as possible under current circumstances. Her response felt like a final answer to questions I would ask more directly rather than hoping voluntary disclosure might make confrontation unnecessary. Elena was committed to maintaining her fictional narrative even during discussions specifically designed to create opportunities for honest communication about relationship problems. I reached into the folder I'd prepared and removed printed copies of her credit card statements from the weekend, bank records that documented her actual location during her fictional San Francisco trip. I placed the papers on the coffee table between us and asked Elena to explain the charges that showed her eating at Screen Door and shopping at Powell's while supposedly attending urgent client meetings 400 miles away. Elena stared at the documents for several seconds, her expression cycling through surprise, calculation, and resignation before settling into defensive preparation for damage control. She said there must be some mistake, that credit card fraud was common and she would need to investigate the unauthorized charges that appeared to show her in Portland while she was actually in San Francisco. I removed additional documentation, photographs of her car in the Hawthorne hotel parking structure, images of her walking with Marcus Walsh, time-stamped evidence that eliminated any possibility of mistaken identity or fraudulent transactions. Elena examined each piece of evidence while her fictional explanations collapsed under the weight of irrefutable documentation. When confronted with proof that couldn't be explained away through technical glitches or fraudulent activity, Elena shifted to partial disclosure designed to minimize damage while maintaining control over the narrative. She admitted to lying about her location but claimed the deception was motivated by professional concerns rather than personal betrayal. Elena explained that she'd been collaborating with Marcus Walsh on strategic initiatives that required discretion due to competitive sensitivities between their companies. The weekend meetings were legitimate business activities that couldn't be conducted openly due to industry protocols about competitor interaction. She'd lied about her location to protect both companies from potential accusations of collusion or inappropriate collaboration. The explanation was sophisticated enough to address the location evidence while avoiding acknowledgement of emotional or physical infidelity. Elena was attempting to contain the damage by admitting to professional misconduct while denying personal betrayal, a strategy that might preserve our marriage while sacrificing her career credibility. I asked why business collaboration required romantic dinners at La Pigeon and intimate walks through downtown Portland rather than conference rooms and professional meeting spaces. Elena said the informal setting was necessary for building trust required for sensitive negotiations, and the appearance of romantic involvement was coincidental rather than intentional. When I showed her the photographs of their kiss outside the Hawthorne hotel, Elena's remaining explanations dissolved into silence that stretched until it acquired weight and substance. She sat on our couch surrounded by evidence of systematic deception, her fictional narratives exhausted and her defensive strategies reduced to wordless calculation of damage and options. I asked Elena directly whether she was having an affair with Marcus Walsh. She stared at the photographs for another 30 seconds, then nodded once without speaking. When I asked how long the relationship had been developing, she said 3 months of increasing emotional connection followed by physical involvement that began 6 weeks ago. Elena described the relationship as unplanned but inevitable, based on professional respect that evolved into personal compatibility and emotional connection she hadn't experienced in years. She claimed the deception was motivated by desire to protect our marriage while exploring feelings that might prove temporary and manageable through discrete boundaries. I asked whether she intended to end the relationship with Marcus and commit to rebuilding our marriage through transparency and accountability. Elena said she didn't know, that the situation was complicated by Marcus's promotion and her uncertainty about what she actually wanted from either relationship moving forward. Her response eliminated any possibility of immediate reconciliation based on acknowledgement of mistakes and commitment to behavior change. Elena was asking for time to decide between maintaining our marriage and pursuing her relationship with Marcus, treating fidelity as a choice between competing options rather than a fundamental requirement for continuing our partnership.
I told Elena that our marriage couldn't survive in a state of suspended decision while she evaluated her alternatives. She needed to choose whether to end her involvement with Marcus and commit to rebuilding trust through consistent honesty and accountability, or whether to pursue her relationship with him while ending our marriage through mutual agreement or legal proceedings. Elena asked for 2 weeks to sort through her feelings and make a decision that would be fair to everyone involved. I told her she could have 2 days, that some decisions couldn't be improved through extended deliberation, and that our marriage deserved either commitment or clean termination rather than indefinite uncertainty while she maintained relationships with both Marcus and me. Friday morning brought Elena's decision delivered through behavior rather than words. She called in sick to work and spent the day packing personal belongings while I attended client meetings and processed the reality that our marriage was ending not through mutual agreement but through Elena's choice to prioritize a relationship that had developed in secret while I was maintaining household systems and assuming we were building a shared future. I returned home that evening to find Elena loading boxes into her car and preparing for temporary relocation to a furnished apartment near downtown Portland. She had signed a month-to-month lease that would provide space for deciding what she wanted while avoiding the immediate pressure of living with either Marcus or me during her decision-making process. Elena's departure was efficient and polite, the kind of domestic logistics that suggested she'd been planning the transition longer than the 2 days I'd given her for decision-making. She took clothes, personal electronics, and items that belonged exclusively to her while leaving shared possessions and household infrastructure for later negotiation. We didn't argue or exchange accusations during the packing process. Elena apologized for the deception while explaining that she'd been trying to avoid hurting me unnecessarily while she explored feelings that might have proven temporary. I accepted her apology while explaining that deception had caused more damage than honesty would have created, regardless of her ultimate decision about our relationship. Elena left our house keys on the kitchen counter and promised to contact me within the week about next steps for dissolving our shared accounts, dividing possessions, and initiating whatever legal proceedings might be necessary. She hugged me goodbye with genuine emotion that felt like grief for something valuable that couldn't be preserved through good intentions and careful management. Saturday morning brought silence that felt like recovery rather than emptiness. I walked through our house and noticed details that had been invisible during months of tension and uncertainty: dust on baseboards, burnt-out light bulbs, the accumulated maintenance tasks that get deferred when emotional energy is consumed by relationship management. I spent the weekend cleaning, organizing, and reconfiguring spaces that no longer needed to accommodate Elena's schedule and preferences. The physical activity provided structure for processing the end of a marriage that had concluded through incremental disconnection rather than dramatic conflict or sudden revelation. Sunday evening brought a text from Elena confirming that she was safe and comfortable in her new apartment while continuing to think through decisions about her future. She thanked me for giving her space to sort through complicated feelings without additional pressure or ultimatums that might have forced premature choices. I replied that I hoped she would find clarity and happiness regardless of her ultimate decisions about our marriage or her relationship with Mark.
Then I deleted the conversation thread and disabled notifications for her contact, creating digital boundaries that would protect my emotional recovery while leaving communication channels available for necessary practical discussions. Monday morning brought the realization that I was free to rebuild my life according to priorities and values that didn't require negotiation or compromise with someone whose loyalty was divided between competing relationships. The freedom felt like recovery from an illness I hadn't recognized while living with its symptoms. Network security had taught me that some intrusions couldn't be repaired through patches and updates. Sometimes the entire system needed to be rebuilt with different architecture and stronger authentication requirements. Elena had chosen to maintain unauthorized access to emotional resources that belonged to our marriage while developing competing relationships that made trust impossible to restore. My marriage was over not because of the affair itself, but because of Elena's commitment to managing multiple relationships simultaneously rather than choosing transparency and exclusive partnership. The deception had been a symptom of divided loyalty rather than temporary poor judgment that could be corrected through acknowledgement and behavior change. Tuesday brought legal consultation with an attorney who specialized in divorce proceedings for couples with shared assets but no children. Relationships that could be dissolved efficiently if both parties approached the process with reasonable expectations and mutual respect for each other's interests. The attorney explained Oregon's no-fault divorce laws and the timeline for dissolving marriages through mutual agreement versus contested proceedings that required court intervention. Elena and I could complete the legal process within 6 months if we maintained cooperative communication about asset division and avoided adversarial positioning that might require judicial resolution. I authorized the attorney to prepare preliminary paperwork while leaving space for Elena to participate in collaborative dissolution rather than contested litigation. The legal framework would protect my interests while demonstrating good faith efforts to minimize conflict and expense during an already difficult transition. Elena called Wednesday evening to discuss practical matters: bank accounts, insurance policies, the mortgage on a house she would no longer share, whose financial obligations require immediate attention and decision-making. Her voice was calm and professional, the tone reserved for managing business relationships rather than processing emotional loss. We agreed to meet Friday evening at a neutral location to sign papers and discuss logistics for the coming weeks. Elena mentioned that Marcus would be relocating to Seattle earlier than originally planned, and she was considering whether to relocate with him or remain in Portland to establish independent living arrangements that didn't depend on either Marcus or me for financial or emotional support. The conversation lasted 20 minutes and covered practical concerns without dwelling on emotional aspects of our marriage's conclusion. Elena sounded relieved rather than grief-stricken, suggesting that ending our marriage felt like resolution rather than loss from her perspective. Thursday morning brought the final verification of Elena's priorities through social media posts that showed her and Marcus exploring Seattle together, apparently conducting real estate research and cultural exploration in preparation for potential relocation. The images showed them comfortable and affectionate, planning a shared future, while Elena's marriage to me underwent legal dissolution. I felt no anger toward Elena or Marcus, only resignation that some relationship problems couldn't be solved through communication and compromise. Elena had chosen personal happiness over marital commitment, a decision that ended our marriage but didn't require revenge or public humiliation as compensation for the emotional damage her choices had caused. Friday evening brought papers to sign and practical discussions about timeline and logistics for completing our divorce. Elena looked healthier than she had in months, stress lines reduced and energy restored through resolution of conflicts that had been consuming her mental and emotional resources. We signed documents in a coffee shop that felt appropriately neutral for business transactions that would terminate our legal partnership while preserving mutual respect and dignity. Elena apologized again for the deception while expressing gratitude that our marriage could end without litigation or accusations that might have created permanent hostility between us. I accepted her apology and wished her happiness with Marcus and whatever life they chose to build together in Seattle. Elena thanked me for giving her space to make decisions without threats or manipulation that might have forced choices based on fear rather than authentic preference. The conversation ended with a handshake rather than a hug, acknowledgement that our relationship had transitioned from marriage to business arrangement that would conclude within 6 months through legal proceedings already initiated. Elena left for her apartment and her new life while I returned to a house that was becoming home again rather than shared accommodation with someone whose priorities had diverged from mine. Network security had taught me that recovery from intrusion required understanding how the breach occurred and what systems needed strengthening to prevent future unauthorized access. Elena had compromised our marriage through social engineering rather than technical failure, using authorized access to gradually expand her privileges until she could operate with minimal oversight. The lesson wasn't that marriage required surveillance and suspicious monitoring, but that it required consistent honesty and exclusive emotional investment from both partners. Elena's divided loyalty had made trust impossible to maintain regardless of her intentions or my willingness to forgive specific instances of deception. Saturday morning brought the first full day of life after Elena that felt like beginning rather than ending. I woke without checking for text messages from her, ate breakfast without accommodating her schedule, and planned activities based on personal interest rather than shared compromise. Freedom arrived quietly rather than dramatically, the gradual realization that decisions could be made without negotiation or explanation to someone whose approval had become conditional on maintaining fiction that served her interest rather than our shared partnership. The house felt larger without tension, quieter without the constant management of information and emotional energy required to maintain relationships with people whose loyalties were divided between competing priorities. I could sleep through the night without listening for whispered phone conversations or monitoring digital activity that had become evidence of betrayal rather than normal communication. Sunday brought recognition that Elena's affair had been a symptom of relationship problems that preceded Marcus Walsh's arrival in her life. We had been growing apart incrementally through months of avoiding difficult conversations about changing priorities and expectations that no longer aligned with shared goals we'd established when marriage seemed like permanent partnership. Elena hadn't left our marriage for Marcus specifically. She'd left for a different life that Marcus represented: professional success, emotional excitement, and freedom from domestic obligations that had begun to feel like constraints rather than chosen commitments. Marcus would discover eventually that Elena was capable of developing competing relationships when her primary partnership stopped meeting her evolving needs. The patterns that had ended our marriage would likely repeat themselves when Elena's relationship with Marcus encountered the inevitable pressures and compromises that test long-term partnerships. But Elena's future relationship choices weren't my responsibility to predict or prevent. My responsibility was rebuilding my own life according to values that prioritized honesty, consistency, and exclusive emotional investment in partnerships that deserved protection from competing relationships that could undermine trust and intimacy. Monday morning brought the beginning of life after marriage that felt like opportunity rather than loss. Network security had prepared me for systematic recovery from data corruption and unauthorized access. The same principles applied to rebuilding personal relationships based on stronger authentication requirements and better boundaries around access to emotional resources that required protection rather than unlimited sharing. Elena had taught me valuable lessons about trust verification and the importance of monitoring relationship health rather than assuming continued functionality based on historical performance. Future partnerships would benefit from clearer expectations about transparency, exclusivity, and the communication requirements that maintain trust even during periods of stress and change. The marriage was over, but the education would continue serving me for decades. Network security and relationship security operated according to similar principles: prevention through proper configuration, monitoring for suspicious activity, and rapid response when intrusion was detected rather than hoping unauthorized access would self-correct through time and good intentions. Elena had moved on to new challenges and opportunities in Seattle with Marcus. I was free to do the same in Portland with someone who shared my values about honesty, commitment, and the basic requirements for maintaining trust in relationships that claim to be permanent. The intrusion was over. Recovery was beginning. The network was secure again, ready for new connections that deserved protection rather than compromise. 6 months later, the divorce papers arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other morning until the envelope changed everything into something final. I signed the documents at my kitchen table with coffee cooling beside me and rain pattering against windows I no longer shared with anyone. The house belonged to me now, bought out through Elena's portion of our accumulated assets and her signature on papers that dissolved 8 years of marriage into legal footnotes. Elena had relocated to Seattle with Marcus 3 months earlier, accepting a senior marketing position at a firm that specialized in tech startups with venture capital backing. Her LinkedIn profile showed professional success and personal satisfaction, photos from industry events where she appeared confident and established in her new environment. Marcus had tagged her in posts about weekend hiking trips and restaurant discoveries, the kind of social media documentation that suggested their relationship had survived the transition from secret affair to public partnership. I felt no bitterness toward their apparent happiness. Elena had chosen authenticity over deception, even if the path to honesty had required ending our marriage rather than repair. She was living according to priorities that had become clear through months of divided loyalty and careful lies. The outcome felt like resolution rather than betrayal. My own life had reconfigured around different rhythms and restored simplicity. Work expanded to fill schedule space that had been reserved for relationship maintenance and emotional processing. I accepted projects that required travel, took consulting contracts that challenged skills I'd been developing through online certification programs. Professional growth had accelerated once personal uncertainty was resolved through legal finality. The house underwent gradual renovation that reflected personal preferences rather than negotiated compromise. I converted Elena's former office into a workshop for electronics projects, installed network equipment that optimized performance for my specific needs, and furnished spaces according to function rather than aesthetic balance between two people whose tastes had never fully aligned. Portland friends gradually stopped asking about Elena and began inviting me to gatherings that assumed single rather than coupled attendance.
I appreciated their discretion about relationship questions while welcoming inclusion in social activities that didn't require explanation or emotional processing of recent changes.
Recovery happened through normal interaction with people who accepted present circumstances without demanding historical analysis. 3 months after the divorce finalized, I received a LinkedIn message from Marcus Walsh that surprised me with its professional tone and apparent sincerity. He requested a brief conversation about business opportunities that might benefit both our companies, specifically mentioning a client project that required network infrastructure expertise his Seattle firm couldn't provide internally. The message felt like an olive branch disguised as business proposition, Marcus attempting to normalize relations between us through professional collaboration that acknowledged shared industry presence without avoiding the personal history that connected us indirectly. I agreed to a phone conversation that lasted 30 minutes and resulted in a consulting contract that proved mutually beneficial. Marcus was competent and straightforward in business communication, focused on project requirements rather than personal issues that might complicate professional collaboration. When he mentioned Elena briefly near the end of our call, it was to acknowledge that she was doing well and adapting successfully to Seattle lifestyle and career opportunities. The reference felt like closure rather than awkward navigation around sensitive subjects. Working with Marcus taught me that people who make destructive choices in personal relationships can still function ethically in professional contexts. His affair with Elena had ended my marriage, but his business practices were honest and his project management was reliable. Separating personal judgment from professional assessment became a useful skill that improved my ability to work with complicated people who demonstrated different values in different contexts. The consulting project led to additional opportunities with other Seattle firms, creating revenue streams that supplemented my Portland client base and expanded my professional network beyond Oregon boundaries. Travel became routine rather than exceptional, exposing me to different business cultures and technical challenges that accelerated skill development and industry reputation. 6 months after working with Marcus, I met Sarah Chen at a technology conference in Vancouver where she was presenting research on cybersecurity applications for small business networks. Her presentation demonstrated expertise that impressed me professionally and personality that attracted me personally. We exchanged contact information and began email correspondence that evolved into phone conversations and eventually regular video calls. Sarah lived in San Francisco but traveled frequently for consulting work that took her throughout the Pacific Northwest. We met for coffee when her schedule brought her to Portland, then dinner during my business trips to the Bay Area. The relationship developed gradually through shared professional interests and compatible personal values about honesty, commitment, and communication priorities that supported rather than undermined partnership goals. 8 months after meeting Sarah, she accepted a permanent position with a Portland cybersecurity firm that allowed her to relocate without sacrificing career advancement. We began dating seriously with explicit discussions about relationship expectations, boundaries, and communication requirements that would maintain trust even during periods of stress and professional pressure. Sarah had experienced her own marriage dissolution 3 years earlier when her ex-husband developed gambling addiction that he concealed through elaborate financial deception. Her experience with betrayal had taught her the importance of transparency and consistent accountability in partnerships that claim to prioritize mutual support over individual convenience. We established relationship protocols that emphasized regular check-ins about satisfaction and concerns, shared access to financial accounts that eliminated opportunities for secret spending, and communication habits that prevented small problems from accumulating into relationship-threatening issues through avoidance and assumption rather than direct discussion. The protocols felt natural rather than restrictive because they codified values we both prioritized rather than imposed external requirements on people who preferred different approaches to partnership management. Sarah understood that trust required active maintenance through consistent behavior rather than passive assumption that good intentions would prevent problems from developing. 2 years after my divorce from Elena, Sarah and I moved in together to a house we purchased jointly in Portland's Richmond district. The decision represented commitment to shared future planning rather than casual cohabitation that could be dissolved without legal or financial complexity. We chose partnership that included legal protection and clear expectations about responsibilities and decision-making authority. The house required renovation that we planned and executed together, making choices that reflected combined preferences rather than individual compromise. Working together on physical projects revealed compatible approaches to problem-solving, budget management, and long-term planning that supported confidence in our ability to navigate more complex challenges that marriage would inevitably present. Sarah proposed to me on a hiking trail near Mount Hood where we'd spent a weekend camping and discussing whether marriage would add value to a relationship that already included legal and financial partnership. She argued that formal commitment would provide additional security and social recognition for a partnership we both intended to maintain permanently regardless of ceremonial status. I accepted immediately because the proposal represented logical next step rather than romantic gesture that might complicate practical considerations with emotional expectations that could create pressure during difficult periods. We planned a small ceremony that focused on legal formalization rather than elaborate celebration that might emphasize performance over substance. The wedding took place 8 months later in Sarah's parents' backyard with 40 guests who knew us well enough to understand that marriage represented thoughtful decision rather than impulsive romantic gestures. Elena sent congratulations through mutual friends, gracious acknowledgement that demonstrated her emotional maturity and genuine care for my happiness despite the difficult circumstances that had ended our relationship. Marcus and Elena married 6 months after my wedding to Sarah, choosing a destination ceremony in Hawaii that reflected their preference for private celebration rather than large social gathering. Their marriage announcement included photos that showed genuine happiness and stability, evidence that their relationship had evolved beyond the secrecy and drama that had characterized its beginning during Elena's mission to me. I felt pleased rather than threatened by their apparent success. Elena had found partnership that matched her current priorities and lifestyle preferences, while I had found partnership that aligned with my values about transparency and exclusive emotional investment. Both relationships were functioning according to different models that suited the people involved. 5 years after my divorce from Elena, I received news that Marcus and Elena were expecting their first child. The announcement came through professional networks rather than personal communication, but the information generated genuine happiness for people who had found stability and were expanding their family according to their shared timeline and preferences. Sarah and I had chosen not to have children, a decision based on career priorities and lifestyle preferences rather than relationship problems or financial constraints. Our marriage was fulfilling without reproduction, focused on professional collaboration and personal partnership that didn't require additional family members to feel complete or purposeful. Network security had taught me that relationships, like computer systems, required regular maintenance and monitoring to function reliably over time. The most stable partnerships were built on compatible architecture rather than forced integration between incompatible systems that generated conflicts requiring constant management and troubleshooting. Elena and I had been incompatible in ways that became clear only after external pressure revealed our different approaches to commitment, honesty, and priority management. Our marriage had failed not because either of us was defective, but because we had different values about transparency and exclusive partnership that couldn't be reconciled through compromise or communication improvement. Sarah and I were compatible in ways that made relationship maintenance straightforward rather than exhausting. We shared similar approaches to problem solving, financial management, and communication that prevented small disagreements from escalating into relationship-threatening conflicts. Our partnership felt sustainable rather than fragile because it was built on shared values rather than romantic attraction that might fade under pressure. 10 years after Elena's affair ended our marriage, I understood that her deception had been necessary for discovering that we were fundamentally incompatible partners who might have spent decades in an unsatisfying marriage if the affairs hadn't forced honest evaluation of our relationship's actual foundation versus its potential for improvement. Elena's betrayal had been painful but ultimately beneficial for both of us. She had found partnership that matched her evolving priorities, while I had learned to recognize and prioritize compatibility over familiarity in future relationships. The affair had been destructive in the short term but educational in ways that improved both our lives over time. Sarah and I celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary by renovating our kitchen together, a project that required months of planning and coordination but resulted in shared satisfaction and improved functionality that enhanced our daily experience of home ownership. The renovation felt like metaphor for marriage itself: careful planning, patient execution, and results that justified the investment of time and resources. The kitchen project also reminded me that some systems couldn't be repaired through patches and updates. Sometimes complete replacement was more efficient than attempting to fix infrastructure that had been built according to different specifications than current requirements demanded. Elena and I needed divorce rather than marriage counseling because our relationship's architecture was incompatible with our evolving values and pride. Sarah and I had built our relationship according to specifications that accommodated growth and change while maintaining structural integrity through shared commitment to transparency and mutual support. Our marriage felt designed for long-term stability rather than short-term satisfaction that might not survive external pressure or internal changes that tested partnership resilience. Standing in our renovated kitchen on a Sunday morning making coffee while Sarah read news on her tablet, I felt grateful for the series of events that had led from Elena's affair through divorce to remarriage with someone whose values aligned with mine about honesty, commitment, and the basic requirements for maintaining trust in partnerships that claim to be permanent. Network security had prepared me for systematic recovery from intrusion and unauthorized acts. The same principles had guided relationship recovery and the construction of new partnership based on stronger authentication requirements and better boundaries around emotional resources that deserve protection rather than unlimited sharing. With people whose loyalty might become divided between competing priorities. Elena had taught me valuable lessons about trust verification and relationship monitoring that served me well with Sarah. The marriage was stable because it was built on compatible architecture rather than forced integration between people whose fundamental approaches to partnership couldn't be reconciled through good intentions and careful management. The affair had ended one marriage but educated me for building another that was stronger, more honest, and more sustainable than what Elena and I had achieved together. Recovery from betrayal had required understanding that some relationship problems indicated incompatibility rather than temporary difficulties that could be resolved through communication and compromise. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.